Hi. When we last left off, the Israelites had made their way into Egypt under the guidance of the God who was supposed to protect them. And for a while, everything seemed stable. But over the next 400 years, they multiplied, grew into a large minority, and became impossible to ignore. And then came the turning point. Pharaoh. Shaken by vivid dreams of disaster and the threat of a people he no longer trusted, turned fear into policy, enslaved the Israelites, and ordered the deaths of their baby boys. And just like that, the story shifted from survival to horror. But out of that violence came one child who slipped through the cracks of the system. A baby whose mother hid him in a basket among the reeds on the bank of the Nile, hoping the river might show more mercy than kings ever do. And in one of history's cruelest twists, Pharaoh's own daughter found him, took him in, and raised him as her own. That child was Moses, the boy born under a death sentence, carried by the same empire that tried to erase his people. And from the very beginning, his life was wrapped in irony, power, and blood. What starts here feels less like a miracle and more like the opening move in a long, brutal chain of events. A chain in which fear breeds cruelty, cruelty breeds legend, and the child who should have died becomes the center of a story that only grows darker from here. Sometimes the life you think is yours is only a mask placed over a deeper story, and the moment that mask breaks, nothing around you can remain untouched. Moses grows up inside the house of power, carried there by a strange mercy that already feels tangled with danger. And for a time, he lives as though the river washed away the truth of his beginning, until one day that hidden root rises up before him, and he learns that he is not Egyptian after all, but Hebrew, born from the people bent beneath the weight of forced labor, and that knowledge does not arrive as comfort. It arrives like a blade dividing the self in two, because now every corridor of privilege becomes haunted, every royal wall feels borrowed, every breath asks a question he can no longer silence. Then the fracture turns outward. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, sees the cruelty laid bare in the open air, and something inside him breaks free before thought can catch it, and he kills the man, perhaps believing for one fierce instant that justice can be seized by the hand, that one act of violence might restore a shattered order, that choosing his people will make him whole. But the next day the illusion collapses. The Hebrews do not embrace him as a deliverer. They recoil, call him a murderer, and in that single moment Moses loses both worlds at once, no longer safe among Egyptians, not fully trusted among Hebrews, a man exiled, not only from a nation, but from any clear name for himself. So he runs into the wilderness, into that ancient place where identities are stripped down to hunger, dust, memory, and silence. And there, in the land of Midian, he begins again. He meets a family, finds shelter, takes a wife, fathers, sons, tends sheep, and it almost feels as though history has loosened its grip on him, as though the hidden wound at the center of his life has finally begun to close. 40 years pass, long enough for the heat of Egypt to become a shadow, long enough for a prince turned fugitive to become a shepherd whose days are measured by hoofbeats and wind over stone. And then one day he leads his flock to the mountain called Horeb, also known as Sinai, and there the silence opens. A bush burns before him, yet is not consumed, and from within that impossible fire comes a voice calling him back into the story he thought he had escaped. The voice names itself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of his ancestors, keeper of a covenant older than empires, and it tells him that the suffering of the Israelites has been seen, that their cries have been heard, and that he, Moses, the man who fled, the man who failed to belong anywhere, is now being sent to lead them out of Egypt and toward Canaan. But Moses does not respond like a hero who has been waiting all his life for destiny to arrive. He hesitates, resists, questions. Who is speaking? By what name? Why him? And the answer that comes is both intimate and unreachable. I am. Not an explanation, not a system, not a philosophy, but a presence that seems to stand before language itself, a name that sounds less like a title and more like a doorway, a mystery that reveals and conceals at once. Moses is given a path, given signs, given instructions, and yet the deeper feeling here is not certainty but disorientation, because what has awakened on the mountain does not simply comfort him, it claims him. He returns to his wife and sons, and together they begin the road back toward the land he once fled, back toward the machinery of empire, back toward the place where blood, memory, and power first tore his life apart. And on that road, in one of the strangest and most unsettling moments in the whole sacred narrative, something dark erupts without warning. The same divine presence that called him now seems to turn against him, as if to kill him, and the scene flashes past like a fragment from a lost dream until Zipporah, his wife, performs a desperate act involving the circumcision of their son and cries out, "You are a bridegroom of blood to me." And somehow the threat passes. The text does not linger to explain, it leaves the wound open. And perhaps that is why it remains so powerful, because it reminds us that the threshold of calling is not always clean, not always gentle, not always understandable. Sometimes the sacred appears first as interruption, as terror, as a force that tears through the life you built in order to return you to the life you were never meant to escape. By the time Moses continues toward Egypt, he is no longer simply a man traveling home. He is a man carrying a voice he does not fully understand, a name born from a fire that was not consumed, and a mission already shadowed by mystery, dread, and the sense that whatever waits ahead will ask far more of him than he is ready to give. And so the man who left Egypt as a fugitive returns to it carrying not certainty, but a summons that feels larger than his own will. And what unfolds next is not merely a political confrontation, but a drama of pressure, refusal, revelation, and the terrible cost of hardened hearts. Moses first finds his brother Aaron, and together they go to the elders of Israel to speak of the promise that has followed him out of the fire. The promise that their suffering has been seen and that a way out is being prepared. And for a brief moment, hope stirs among a people who have almost forgotten what hope feels like. But hope, when it rises inside a house of bondage, often provokes the system to tighten its grip before it breaks. Moses and Aaron stand before Pharaoh and ask that the Hebrews be allowed to go into the wilderness for 3 days to offer sacrifice. And Pharaoh answers not with mercy, but with contempt, treating their request as laziness, as insolence, as a threat to order, and he responds by making the labor even harder, forcing the Israelites to gather their own straw while still demanding the same number of bricks, turning pain into policy, exhaustion into punishment. This is how empire often reveals itself, not only by chains, but by the cold logic that says suffering must increase whenever freedom is imagined. Then come the signs. Aaron casts down his staff, and it becomes a serpent, and Pharaoh's magicians perform the same wonder with their own staffs, as if the world itself is briefly admitting that power wears many masks. Yet Aaron's serpent swallows theirs, and still Pharaoh does not bend. What follows unfolds like a series of blows against the visible order of Egypt, each plague striking not only the land, but the illusion of control that holds an empire together. The Nile turns to blood, the river of life made into a sign of corruption, but Pharaoh refuses. Frogs rise in overwhelming numbers, invading rooms, ovens, beds, and breathing spaces. And when Pharaoh finally asks for relief, the frogs are taken away, yet his resolve hardens once more. Then come lice, then flies, then pestilence, then boils, and the pattern becomes almost unbearable. Suffering rises, Warning is given, relief appears possible, and still refusal returns. It is as though each plague is not only an event in the outer world, but an image of what happens in the inner world whenever power chooses pride over transformation. Hail crashes down, locusts consume what remains, darkness covers the land with a heaviness that feels older than weather, and still the final threshold has not yet been crossed. The deepest wound comes last. The Israelites are told to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb, to prepare for departure, to eat as those who may be called to move before dawn. And in the night, death passes through Egypt, taking the firstborn in every house not marked for passing over, from palace to prison. And by morning, the cries stretch across the land like a single unbearable sound. Pharaoh breaks. At last, he tells them to go. Yet even release carries its own strange burden, because the departing Israelites do not leave empty-handed. They take with them silver, gold, and garments from the Egyptians, as though the years of bondage are being answered by a last reversal of wealth before the road opens. Then the people move, led by a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, a visible sign that they are no longer walking under the logic of Egypt alone. And yet the path they are given does not look like wisdom. It leads them toward the Red Sea, toward apparent entrapment, and fear rises immediately, because liberation always feels most fragile when the old world is still close enough to chase you. Behind them, Pharaoh's heart turns again, and he sends 600 chariots after them, drawing the full force of Egypt into the pursuit. Ahead is water. Behind is iron. Between them stands only the trembling possibility that the path no longer belongs to the visible order of things. The pillar moves between the two camps, veiling one, unsettling the other, and Moses stretches out his hand over the sea. Then the waters part. A way appears where no way should be, and the Israelites cross on dry ground with walls of water on either side, walking through the impossible as though the world has opened a wound just wide enough for them to pass through it alive. And once the people of Israel were far enough across, the sea closed again, and the force that pursued them was swallowed. Here the story could almost end as a triumph, a people delivered, an empire broken, a promise within reach. But freedom, once granted outwardly, still has to be learned inwardly. And the desert that waits on the other side will reveal that leaving bondage behind is not the same as having bondage leave the soul. And beyond the miracle itself, another journey begins, quieter and far more difficult, because the sea can close behind a people long before fear closes inside them. The journey from the waters to the promised land should have been short, yet the road stretches, bends, delays, and returns them to the deeper work no miracle can complete on its own. They come to Sinai, the mountain where presence descends again, and Moses is called upward into cloud, fire, and distance, while the people remain below with their fear, their memory, and the gold they carried out of Egypt. On the mountain, Moses receives more than a destination. He receives a pattern, instructions, and a vision for the tabernacle, a dwelling place shaped in exacting detail, as if the invisible now seeks form among human hands, as if liberation without orientation would only dissolve into confusion. He also receives commandments, words cut toward order, identity, and covenant. But while he is above, the people below cannot bear the silence. They ask Aaron for something they can see, something immediate, something visible enough to soothe the ache of uncertainty. And from the gold of Egypt they fashion a calf, an image born from fear as much as desire, a substitute for presence that can be touched, named, and controlled. This is one of the oldest movements in the human soul. When the unseen feels too distant, we return to what glitters. Moses descends carrying the tablets and sees the idol, and the shock of that sight breaks something in him. He smashes the stone, as though the covenant itself has struck the ground before it ever reached the people intact. Then come anger, judgment, death, pleading, and negotiation. The narrative grows heavy here, layered with tension, because Moses stands between a people who cannot yet hold the freedom they were given and a presence too intense to be reduced to their fear. A line seems to open between destruction and mercy, and Moses spends himself in that space, interceding, asking that the whole nation not be consumed for the sin of some. In time, the tabernacle is built as commanded, and the presence descends into it with such force that even Moses cannot enter at first, because the nearness is too strong. What was spoken on the mountain now burns at the center of the camp, and yet even this nearness does not make the human heart simple. There are more instructions, more rituals, more boundaries, as though the people must slowly learn how to live near mystery without trying to possess it. Then another rupture. Aaron's sons offer unauthorized fire before the Lord, and they die in the blaze that answers them. A moment as severe as it is difficult, a warning that not every approach to the sacred leaves a person unchanged. The laws that follow in Leviticus can seem strange from the outside, but within the rhythm of the story, they form a language of separation, purification, remembrance, and return. A constant reminder that freedom is not only escape from oppression, but also the slow shaping of a different inner order. A year passes at Sinai, and then the people move again toward Canaan, only to discover that the wilderness outside them has an echo within them. At Paran, spies are sent into the land, and they return with a divided report. The land is rich, but its cities are strong, and its warriors terrifying. Fear spreads fast. The people recoil at the threshold of promise, not because the promise has vanished, but because entering it would require a level of trust they do not yet possess. So the generation that left Egypt is told it will wander for 40 years, 1 year for each day the land was searched, until a new generation rises. This is not only punishment in the outer sense. It reads almost like a spiritual law. What is not faced consciously must be walked through repeatedly until it becomes visible. The wilderness years unfold in cycles of complaint, lack, provision, rebellion, and correction. Water runs out, and water is drawn from stone. Serpents strike, and a bronze serpent is lifted up so that those who look upon it may live, a strange and unforgettable image that feels less like magic than an inward mirror. Healing comes not by denying the wound, but by facing its image directly. Moses himself falters. In bringing forth water, he takes too much of the moment into himself, and the consequence is severe. He will not enter the land. Even the chosen mediator cannot possess the promise as a personal reward. There are rebellions, judgments, moments of mercy, and the long erosion of the old generation's certainty. By the time the people reach the plains of Moab, after curses attempted and blessings turned aside, the story has been purified by loss. Moses speaks one final time to the new generation, not as a conqueror, but as a witness who has seen both bondage and mystery, both law and failure, both nearness and distance. Then he climbs the mountain and dies within sight of what he cannot enter. And this is where the ancient Gnostic imagination begins to lean in more closely. Not always to deny the story, but to read its shadows, its fractures, its troubling edges, and to ask whether the surface meaning is the whole meaning. Later books deepened that unease. Wars in Canaan, cycles of violence in Judges, the destructive commands and disturbing permissions of Samuel and Kings, the heavenly courtroom in Job, the unsettling line in Isaiah about creating calamity, the prophetic tensions in Ezekiel, the strange admissions in Jonah. For some early readers, these were not loose ends to be ignored, but clues, pressure points, signs that the sacred text might contain layers not immediately visible, and that what appears divine on the surface may still need to be discerned inwardly. Whether one accepts that reading or not, the emotional force remains. These stories endure because they do not leave the listener untouched. They ask what kind of power we obey, what image we build when silence frightens us, what part of us still longs for Egypt even after the waters have parted, and whether the promised land is only a place ahead of us, or also a state of being that can only be entered once illusion has burned away. And so what remains is not a final answer, but the feeling of having walked through something ancient, unsettling, and strangely intimate, as if these old stories were not only about distant figures and forgotten worlds, but about the hidden fractures, longings, and awakenings that still move quietly inside a human life. What began in tension, mystery, and contradiction settles here into stillness, with the sense that not everything must be resolved in order to be deeply felt. To me, that is what makes this reading of Gnosticism so compelling. It does not close the wound too quickly, and it leaves space for wonder, discomfort, and reflection to exist together. I'd really like to know how this landed for you. What did you feel while listening, and which part stayed with you the most? You can share one thought in the comments, maybe even just, the part that stayed with me was. If this resonated with you, liking the video and subscribing helps support more thought-provoking stories like this. Thank you for watching and for being here.